The pen was heavier than it should have been. Imani Reed stared at the contract on the mahogany desk, the words blurring through her tears. Transfer of debt obligation. Full settlement. Legal guardian rights relinquished. The gold-embossed paper might as well have been a death certificate. Sign it. Her uncle's voice slithered across the dim study, thick with cigar smoke and expensive cologne that couldn't mask the rot underneath. Or you can explain to the collectors why a dead girl's daughter thinks she's too good to pay what's owed. The room was all deep blacks and shadowed browns, chandeliers glittering like distant, uncaring stars. Men in sharp suits lined the walls, witnesses, enforcers, vultures waiting for the signing of her life away. Her aunt sat in the corner, examining her nails, the same woman who'd stripped her mother's jewelry box 3 days after the funeral. Imani's hand trembled as she reached for the pen. 19 years old, and this was how her story ended. Sold like furniture to cover debts she never knew existed, to pay for her relatives' mistakes with her parents' blood money. Good girl. Her uncle's hand landed on her shoulder, fingers sliding toward the nape of her neck like he owned her already. See? You can be reasonable when you... The hand never finished its journey. A vice grip caught her uncle's wrist mid-touch, the crack of bone audible in the sudden, suffocating silence. Her uncle's scream died in his throat as he was yanked backward, stumbling into the wall with a force that rattled the crystal decanters. Imani looked up. The man standing behind her chair was a study in controlled violence. Immaculate black suit tailored to perfection, dark hair swept back from a face carved from ice and shadow. His eyes, cold, calculating, utterly devoid of mercy, swept across the room like a predator assessing prey. Min Jae Choi. The Dragon of Soul. Her buyer. Gentleman's agreement, Min Jae said, his accent precise, his tone conversational despite the way he still held her uncle's wrist at an angle that promised permanent damage. She signs of her own will, or she doesn't sign at all. He released her uncle with a flick of disgust, letting the man crumple to the floor clutching his arm. Then those dead eyes found Imani's, and something flickered in their depths, something she couldn't name. And you, his voice dropped to a register that made every man in the room tense. You don't touch what belongs to me. The room held its breath. Min Jae moved around the desk with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, positioning himself between Imani and the rest of the room. He straightened his cufflinks with the same casual precision a man might use to load a gun, then gestured to the contract. Miss Reed. Not a command. Not quite a request. The debt your family incurred totals $2.7 million. I have purchased this obligation in full. The contract transfers guardianship and debt settlement to my authority. He paused, and for a fraction of a second, his gaze dropped to the tear tracks on her cheeks. You may sign, or you may walk out that door. The choice is yours. Imani's breath caught. Every predator in this room had told her she had no choices left. But here was the most dangerous man in Korea, the man who just paid millions to own her, offering her the illusion of freedom. Or was it an illusion? Her aunt spoke up from the corner, voice sharp with panic. The agreement states. The agreement, Min Jae interrupted without looking away from Imani, states what I decide it states. I bought your debts, Mrs. Reed. Not your niece's will. He reached into his jacket, and every guard in the room tensed. But what he withdrew wasn't a weapon. It was a handkerchief, silk, expensive, monogrammed. He held it out to Imani. You're crying, he said simply. I don't require signatures from women in distress. Dry your eyes. Think. Then decide. Imani took the handkerchief with shaking fingers, the fabric impossibly soft against her skin. It smelled like sandalwood and something darker, more dangerous. As she pressed it to her face, she studied the man who just defended her from her own family. The Dragon of Soul. Cold-blooded. Merciless. The man who made entire syndicates disappear. So why did he care about her tears? Why did he stop her uncle's touch with more violence than he'd shown about the money? And why, did she feel safer in this moment, with a mafia boss between her and her own blood, than she had in months? Imani lowered the handkerchief, picked up the pen, and met Min Jae's obsidian eyes. If I sign, she whispered, what happens to me? The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. More like the promise of something she couldn't yet understand. Everything, he said. Everything happens to you. The pen touched paper. And Imani Reed's old life ended with a scratch of ink across gold-embossed parchment, in a room full of shadows and chandeliers, under the watchful gaze of a dragon who'd been waiting for this moment far longer than she could possibly know. Sold. The car ride to Min Jae's estate was 47 minutes of suffocating quiet. Imani sat in the back of a black Mercedes that smelled like leather and money, watching Seoul's glittering skyline give way to darker, more exclusive neighborhoods where walls grew higher and security cameras multiplied like eyes. Min Jae sat across from her, checking his phone with the detached efficiency of a man reviewing stock portfolios, not the life he'd just purchased. She clutched his handkerchief in her fist, the monogram, MJC, pressed into her palm like a brand. He hadn't spoken since they left the study. Hadn't explained. Hadn't threatened. Just gestured to the car and waited for her to make the choice to get in. Which, rationally, wasn't a choice at all. Where else could she go? Back to the relatives who'd sold her. To the empty apartment they'd already cleared out, her mother's things vanished into pawn shops and garbage bags. At least the dragon's cage came with a car that didn't smell like her uncle's cigars. The gates to the estate opened like a mouth swallowing them whole, wrought iron and security checkpoints, guards in dark suits who bowed to Min Jae's window. The house beyond was less a home and more a fortress. Modern architecture meets traditional Korean elegance, all clean lines and dark stone, windows that reflected the night sky like obsidian mirrors. Beautiful. Cold. Absolute. Just like its owner. Min Jae exited the car first, then, unexpectedly, held the door open for her. Imani stepped out onto marble pavement, her cheap sneakers squeaking against stone that probably cost more than her entire former life. This way. His voice cut through the night air, and he moved toward the entrance without checking if she followed. She did. What else could she do? The interior was exactly what she expected, minimalist luxury, every surface deliberate, every angle calculated. Dark woods, soft gold accent lighting, art that probably belonged in museums. But as they moved through the foyer, past a grand staircase that split like a serpent's tongue, Imani noticed something odd. Flowers. Fresh peonies, her mother's favorite, in a crystal vase on the entrance table. Min Jae noticed her staring. You don't like them? She swallowed. How did you know my mother loved peonies? He didn't answer. Just continued walking, leading her deeper into his world. They climbed the left staircase to the second floor, down a hallway lined with doors that might as well have been cells. Min Jae stopped at the last one, pushed it open, and stepped aside. Your room. Imani entered cautiously, expecting, she didn't know what. A cage? A prison cell dressed as luxury? Instead, she found a sanctuary. The room was enormous, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens, a bed that could fit 4 people draped in silk the color of deep wine. But it was the details that made her breath catch. A vintage record player in the corner, a stack of vinyl beside it. Nina Simone on top. Her mother's favorite artist. A bookshelf filled with the exact editions she'd lost when her relatives cleared out her apartment, Octavia Butler, Toni Morrison, the worn copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God she'd annotated in high school. A desk with art supplies. The specific brand of charcoal pencils she used for sketching, the ones she could no longer afford. Her favorite snacks from the Korean corner store near her old place, honey butter chips, banana milk, arranged on a side table like an offering. Imani turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. What is this? Min Jae stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway, his expression unreadable. Your preferences. I assumed you'd be more comfortable with familiar things. But how? Her voice cracked. How do you know any of this? We've never met. You just bought me tonight and you know my mother's favorite flowers, my favorite artist, my... Get some rest, Miss Reed. He moved to leave, then paused, his hand on the doorframe. When he looked back at her, something ancient and hungry flickered behind his eyes. Tomorrow, we'll discuss the terms of your arrangement. But tonight, you're safe. No one will touch you here. No one will hurt you. Why? The word burst out before she could stop it. Why do you care? You paid to own me. Why does it matter if I'm comfortable or safe or... Because, Min Jae said softly, and the tenderness in his voice was somehow more terrifying than any threat, you were never supposed to suffer in the first place. He closed the door. Imani stood alone in a room that knew her better than a stranger should, surrounded by ghosts of a life she thought she'd lost, in the home of a dragon who'd been watching her long before tonight's transaction. And as she sank onto the bed, his silk handkerchief still clutched in her hand, one question burned through her mind. How long has he been obsessed with me? Imani didn't sleep that first night. Instead, she lay in silk sheets that cost more than her former rent and remembered the day her world ended. 3 months ago. The phone call that split time into before and after. Miss Reed? This is Seattle General Hospital. There's been an accident. Her parents, her brilliant, loving parents who'd built a small empire from a single Korean-American grocery store, gone in a moment. Black ice on I-5. A semi-truck that didn't brake in time. The kind of random violence that made the universe feel cruel and arbitrary. She'd flown back from her freshman year at Howard, numb and floating, to find her aunt and uncle already in her parents' house. Already sorting through belongings. Already making calls to lawyers and accountants with voices drenched in false sympathy. Poor thing, her aunt had cooed, embracing her with perfume-soaked arms. Don't worry about anything, sweetheart. Family takes care of family. We'll handle all the difficult details. Imani had been too shattered to question it. Too broken to notice when documents appeared for her signature, estate transfers, business dissolutions, things her grief-drunk mind couldn't process. Her uncle explaining in soothing tones about protecting her inheritance and simplifying the complicated assets. She'd signed. God help her, she'd signed everything they put in front of her. The grocery store, her father's pride, the place he'd built from nothing, sold within 2 weeks. Market value, her uncle assured her. The life insurance payout, mysteriously reduced by outstanding business debts she'd never heard of. Her mother's jewelry, her father's collection of rare Korean pottery, the savings account they'd built for her education, all of it flowing through her relatives' hands like water through a sieve. By the time the fog of grief lifted enough for Imani to ask questions, there was nothing left to ask about. Actually, her uncle had said, his smile sharp as a blade, there is something left. Turns out your father had some obligations. Gambling debts from his early days in Seoul, before he met your mother. Bad people, Imani. Very bad people. And now that he's gone, well, debts passed to family. She'd laughed. Actually laughed. That's insane. My father never gambled. He didn't even buy lottery tickets. Her uncle's smile never wavered. Tell that to the men who'll come collecting. Or, he'd leaned forward, all pretense of sympathy evaporating. Or you can be a good girl and fix the mess your parents left behind. That was 6 weeks ago. Now, lying in a dragon's fortress, Imani finally understood. Her parents never owed anyone anything. Her relatives had fabricated the debt, stripped her inheritance, and sold her to cover their own sins. And somehow, Min Jae Choi had known exactly when to buy. Morning came too soon, bleeding pale gold through floor-to-ceiling windows Imani hadn't thought to curtain. She woke disoriented, tangled in sheets that smelled like sandalwood and expensive detergent, her body convinced for 3 confused seconds that she was still in her cramped Seattle apartment. Then memory crashed back. The contract. The dragon. The room that knew her secrets. She sat up slowly, taking in details she'd been too overwhelmed to process last night. The walls were painted a soft, warm cream, not the stark white she expected from a Mafia fortress. Original artwork hung in careful arrangement, a behind Wiley print she'd admired in a museum catalog once, a photograph of Seoul's skyline at sunset, and something that made her breath catch, a framed sketch of a black woman in traditional hanbok, the style unmistakably her mother's hand. How did he have her mother's art? A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. The door opened before she could respond, and a small Korean woman in her 50s entered carrying a breakfast tray. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes held something almost like sympathy. "Good morning, Miss Reed. I'm Mrs. Pak, the house manager. Mr. Choi asked me to bring you breakfast." She set the tray on the desk with practiced efficiency. "He's been called away on business but will return this evening to discuss your arrangement." Imani's stomach chose that moment to remind her she hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch. The tray held an unexpected spread, fluffy buttermilk pancakes with real maple syrup, turkey bacon cooked crispy the way she liked it, fresh strawberries, and, impossibly, a bottle of her favorite mango peach smoothie from the health food store 3 blocks from her old apartment. The same breakfast her mother used to make every Sunday. "How?" Imani's voice came out strangled. "Mrs. Pak, how long have you worked for Mr. Choi?" "5 years, miss." "Has he ever brought anyone else here? Like this?" Mrs. Pak's expression flickered, surprise, maybe, or discomfort. "No, Miss Reed. In 5 years, you're the first guest to stay in this wing." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Choi had the room prepared 3 weeks ago. Every detail personally approved. Whatever you're thinking about him, it's probably more complicated than you imagine." 3 weeks ago. Before the final meeting with her relatives. Before the contract was even signed. Imani stared at the breakfast tray, at the evidence of surveillance disguised as care, and felt the walls of her golden cage shimmer into focus. Min Jae Choi hadn't just bought her last night. He'd been planning to own her all along. Min Jae returned at sunset, when the sky bled crimson through the windows and painted his fortress in shades of blood and gold. Imani had spent the day exploring her gilded prison, the room, at least, since she wasn't brave enough to wander the halls unsupervised. She'd sketched to calm her nerves, flipped through books without reading them, and constructed a dozen escape plans that all ended with the same question: escape to where? When the door opened without warning, she was curled in the window seat, still wearing yesterday's clothes because no one had offered her anything else. "Miss Reed." Min Jae stood in the doorway, somehow more imposing in casual clothes, black slacks, white shirt with sleeves rolled to his forearms. Less executioner, more dangerously human. "We need to discuss the terms." Her heart kicked against her ribs. "The terms of my ownership, you mean?" Something sharp flickered across his face. "Come with me." It wasn't a request. He turned and walked, clearly expecting her to follow. Imani hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before her survival instincts overrode her pride. She followed him through marble hallways to a private study lined with books in Korean, English, and languages she couldn't identify. He gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. She sat. He remained standing, backlit by the dying sun, studying her with those obsidian eyes that saw too much. "Ask me," he said quietly. "What?" "You have questions. Anger. Fear. Ask me whatever you need to ask, and I'll answer with the truth." He moved to pour himself whiskey from a crystal decanter, the liquid catching the light like amber fire. "But understand this first, I don't care about the money. Your relatives could have owed me $27 million and I'd have paid it without blinking. The debt was always just a means to an end. Imani's hands clenched in her lap. Then what do you care about? You. The word landed between them like a knife. I care that you don't lie to me, Imani. I care that when you're afraid, you tell me. When you're angry, you show me. When you want something, you ask. He took a slow sip, never breaking eye contact. I've watched people perform their entire lives. I won't tolerate it from you. You want honesty? Her voice shook with fury she'd been swallowing all day. Fine. I think you're insane. I think whatever obsession made you stalk me and buy me like property is sick. And I think you're a monster pretending civility makes you anything else. The silence stretched. Then Min Jae smiled, a real smile, sharp and hungry and somehow satisfied. Good, he said softly. Now we can begin. Min Jae set his whiskey down and opened a drawer in his desk. When his hand emerged, it held a red leather folder, the kind lawyers used for important documents. He placed it on the desk between them like an offering. Open it. Imani stared at the folder as if it might contain a snake. What is it? The first truth. He slid it closer to her. Open it, Imani. Her hands trembled as she pulled the folder across the polished wood. The leather was butter soft, expensive, and when she lifted the cover, the first document stole the breath from her lungs. Deed of property transfer. Reed and Son Korean American Grocery. 1247 Jackson Street, Seattle, Washington. Transferred from Reed Holdings LLC. Transferred to Imani Grace Reed. Her father's store. The business her uncle had liquidated 6 weeks after the funeral, claiming market necessity and outstanding obligations. The place where her father had taught her to count in Korean, where her mother had sketched customers while manning the register, where Imani had spent every summer of her childhood stocking shelves and learning that home could smell like Ichiguru and possibility. I don't understand. Her vision blurred. They sold it. It's gone. They sold it to a shell corporation for 30 cents on the dollar. Min Jae's voice was clinical, but something burned beneath the surface. I bought that corporation yesterday. The store is yours again. Fully operational, fully staffed, generating the profit it always should have. Imani flipped to the next document. Then the next. Each one a piece of her stolen life, returned. Her mother's jewelry collection, recovered from 3 different pawn shops. The life insurance payout, deposited into an account in her name, the full amount, not the gutted remains her relatives had claimed. Her parents' house, purchased back from the investors her uncle had sold it to. Her college fund, mysteriously replenished and transferred to her control. How? The word caught in her throat. How did you do this so fast? I started 3 months ago. Min Jae watched her with predatory stillness. The day after your parents died, when your relatives began their theft, I began building the case to undo it. Every piece they stole, I tracked. Every lie they told, I documented. He leaned forward. You were never supposed to lose any of it, Imani. You were only supposed to lose your freedom long enough for me to give you everything else back. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, the red folder trembling in her hands. Why? Why would you do this? His expression shifted into something ancient and possessive and terrifyingly tender. Because, Min Jae said, you were mine to protect long before you were mine to own. Imani couldn't sleep again. The red folder sat on her desk like an accusation, each document a question she didn't know how to ask. Min Jae had left her alone after his confession, retreating into whatever dark business occupied Dragons after midnight. You were mine to protect long before you were mine to own. The words circled her mind like vultures. 3 months, he'd said. He'd been tracking her relatives' theft for 3 months. But the room, this room with its perfect details, her mother's art, her specific brand of charcoal pencils, had been prepared 3 weeks ago. How long had he really been watching? She rose from bed at 2 in the morning, driven by a need she couldn't name. The mansion was silent except for the whisper of her bare feet on marble floors. She moved through hallways lit by ambient nightlights, past closed doors and sleeping secrets, until she found herself in a wing she hadn't explored. The last door at the end of the corridor was different from the others, heavier, with a biometric lock that glowed soft red in the darkness. Imani touched the handle without thinking. It clicked open. Either Min-jae's security was catastrophically flawed, or he'd programmed her access deliberately. She suspected the latter. He wanted her to find this. The room beyond stole the air from her lungs. It was a gallery. Walls lined with frames, a digital archive glowing on multiple monitors, filing cabinets with dates written in precise Korean script. And every single piece of it was her. Imani at 17, laughing outside her high school in Seattle. Imani at 18, moving into her Howard University dorm, her father's arm around her shoulders. Imani at the Korean grocery, sketching behind the counter. Imani at her mother's grave, alone and breaking. Photographs. Dozens of them. Hundreds. 3 years of her life catalogued like a museum exhibition of obsession. But it wasn't just photos. There were sketches, professional quality, rendered in charcoal and ink, of her face from every angle. Notes in Korean she couldn't read. A timeline on the wall tracking her movements, her routines, her relationships. Contact sheets from a surveillance operation that should have terrified her. She moved deeper into the room, her hands shaking. Found a leather journal on the desk, opened to a page dated 2 years ago. She ordered the mango peach smoothie again today. 3rd time this week. Her smile when she drinks it reminds me of summer in Jeju, before everything burned. You weren't supposed to find this tonight. Imani spun. Min-jae stood in the doorway, still dressed, as if he'd been waiting. His expression was carefully blank, but his hands were clenched at his sides. 3 years, she whispered. You've been watching me for 3 years. He didn't deny it. Didn't apologize. Just met her eyes with that terrible, unwavering intensity. Longer, he said quietly. But I only started documenting 3 years ago. The gown was a work of art, midnight blue silk that pooled like oil, cut to honor every curve Min-jae had apparently memorized years ago. Imani stared at her reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back. Hair styled in elegant locks swept to one side, makeup subtle but devastating, jewelry that probably cost more than most people's cars. She looked like she belonged in his world. That was the terrifying part. You're ready. Min-jae appeared behind her in the mirror, immaculate in a tailored tuxedo that made him look less like a gangster and more like old money royalty. He extended his arm. Stay close to me tonight. Speak only when spoken to. And if anyone makes you uncomfortable, you look at me. What is this event, exactly? A gathering of interested parties. Business associates, allies, competitors. His smile was knife-sharp. I'm introducing you to Seoul's underworld. They need to understand what you are to me. What she was to him. His obsession. His possession. His, what? The word, girlfriend, seemed laughably insufficient for whatever sick, complicated thing bound them together. The ballroom was old-world opulence meets modern excess, crystal chandeliers the size of cars, marble floors polished to mirrors, and enough wealth concentrated in one room to end world hunger twice over. Men in expensive suits and women dripping diamonds turned to watch as Min-jae entered with Imani on his arm. The whispers started immediately. She caught fragments in English and Korean, black girl, American, the dragon's new pet. Min-jae's hand tightened fractionally on hers. A warning, or comfort, she couldn't tell. They moved through the crowd like sharks through water, Min-jae accepting greetings with curt nods, introducing her to faces that blurred together. She smiled. Stayed silent. Played the part of beautiful accessory while her skin crawled with the weight of predatory stares. Then they reached a man who looked at her like she was meat on a hook. Older, European, with cold eyes and a smile that made her want to shower. He said something in Korean to Min Jae, casual tone, but the men around them tensed like soldiers anticipating gunfire. Min Jae's expression didn't change. But the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Say it in English, Min Jae said softly, so she can understand why I'm going to break your jaw. The man's smile widened. I simply asked how much you paid for such exotic. The crack of bone was audible over the orchestra. Min Jae moved with surgical precision, one step forward, one calculated strike that sent the European crashing into a dessert table. Champagne flutes shattered. Women screamed. But no one intervened. Min Jae straightened his cufflinks, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. She is Imani Reed. You will address her with respect, or you will address your surgeon. He turned back to her, extended his hand again, his knuckles already bruising. Shall we dance? The betrayal came from inside the fortress. Imani woke to chloroform sweetness and rough hands dragging her from silk sheets. She fought through chemical fog, her limbs heavy and uncooperative, catching only fragments, a familiar face, one of Min Jae's own men, his expression apologetic but determined. Sorry, miss. Orders from someone who pays better than the dragon. Then darkness swallowed her whole. She came to with her head pounding and her wrists zip-tied behind her back. The air was thick with salt and rust, and the walls around her were corrugated metal that sweated condensation in the humidity. A shipping container. She could hear water lapping against dock pilings, the distant cry of seabirds, the industrial groan of cranes moving cargo. Incheon port. Had to be. The container door was sealed, leaving her in darkness broken only by thin strips of light through ventilation slats near the ceiling. Imani's breath came too fast, panic clawing at her throat. She forced herself to slow down, to think like Min Jae would think, cold, calculated, 3 steps ahead. Her captors had been sloppy. They'd tied her wrists but not her ankles. They'd taken her phone but missed the small knife Min Jae had insisted she keep in her bra after the ball, just in case my protection fails. She worked the blade free with awkward movements, nearly dropping it twice before managing to saw through the plastic restraints. Her wrists burned, slick with blood, but she was free. Free in a locked shipping container in a port controlled by people who wanted to hurt the dragon by hurting her. Voices outside. Korean, spoken too fast for her limited understanding, but she caught Min Jae's name. Laughter. Someone saying something about bait and territorial concessions. They were going to use her to force Min Jae to surrender parts of his empire. Or they were going to kill her and watch him burn the world down in grief. Either way, she was a pawn in someone else's game again. Like hell. Imani studied the container with new eyes. The ventilation slats were too small to escape through, but the corrugated walls had weak points where rust had eaten through the metal. She had a knife. She had time before they moved her. And she had 3 years of a Mafia boss's obsessive protection teaching her one critical lesson. She wasn't helpless anymore. The dragon had given her claws. Now she just needed to decide whether to use them. The explosion came at dawn. Imani had managed to pry loose a section of corroded metal when the world erupted in fire and thunder. The shipping container shook, throwing her against the wall. Gunfire cracked like breaking bones, automatic weapons, close and getting closer. Men screaming. Then silence more terrifying than the chaos. Footsteps approached. Deliberate. Unhurried. The sound of a predator who knew every threat was already eliminated. The container door shrieked open, flooding her prison with pale morning light and the smell of gunpowder. Min Jae stood silhouetted against the burning port, his white shirt splattered with blood that wasn't his, a gun hanging loose in his right hand. Behind him, bodies littered the dock like discarded props. He'd come alone. One man against an entire operation. And he'd won. Imani. Her name on his lips was a prayer and a curse. He stepped inside, and she saw his face properly, the cold mask shattered, replaced by something raw and devastating. His hands found her face, her shoulders, checking for injuries with trembling fingers. Did they hurt you? I'm fine. Min-jae, He pulled her against his chest so hard she lost her breath, his arms steel bands crushing her into safety. She felt him shake, this terrifying man who just massacred a dozen people without breaking stride, shaking like he'd almost lost the only thing that mattered. I would have burned the entire city, he whispered into her hair. Every building. Every street. Every person who looked at you wrong. Do you understand? There is nothing I wouldn't destroy for you. Imani pulled back enough to see his face. Why? You need to tell me why. The truth. All of it. Something broke behind his eyes. He cupped her face with blood-stained hands, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. Your father saved my life when I was 17. A stupid kid running from a gang war I'd started, bleeding out in his store at 3 in the morning. He should have called the police. Instead, he stitched me up, fed me, and told me I could be more than the violence that made me. Min-jae's thumb traced her cheekbone. I spent the next decade becoming the dragon so I'd be powerful enough to protect his family if they ever needed it. Imani's world tilted. My father knew you? He never knew what I became. But when he died, when your relatives started their theft, I knew exactly how to save you. His smile was bitter, broken. I fabricated the gambling debt, Imani. I created the trap that forced them to sell you. Because it was the only way to bring you here, into my protection, before they destroyed you completely. The confession hung between them like smoke. You orchestrated everything, she breathed. My whole nightmare. To end a worse one. Yes. The rain fell in sheets the day Imani returned to her family home. Not as a victim. Not as the orphaned girl they'd stripped and sold. But as something new, something forged in obsession and fire and the terrible understanding that monsters could love, and love could be monstrous. The Mercedes pulled up to the house her parents had built, where her childhood lived in every corner, now infested with parasites wearing her blood. Min-jae's men flanked the entrance, silent sentinels in dark suits, guns hidden but promised. Min-jae opened her door himself, extending his hand. You don't have to do this. I can handle it. No. Imani stepped out into the rain, letting it soak her hair, her skin, washing away the last traces of the girl who'd signed her life away in that smoky study. This is mine to do. Her aunt answered the door, irritation melting into shock, then fear. Imani? What are you? Get my uncle. Now. They gathered in the living room like a parody of family, her aunt clutching pearls that had belonged to Imani's mother, her uncle in a chair that had been her father's favorite, surrounded by artwork and furniture they'd stolen from a dead man's legacy. Imani stood before them with the dragon at her back, silent and lethal. You have 1 hour to remove yourselves from this house, she said, her voice steady as stone. Take nothing but the clothes on your backs. Every item here belongs to my parents' estate, which has been legally restored to me. Every account you emptied has been refilled and frozen under my control. Every lie you told has been documented and delivered to the appropriate authorities. Her uncle surged to his feet. You can't. I can. Imani smiled, and it was Min-jae's smile, sharp and merciless. Because the Dragon of Soul decided I could. Because the most dangerous man in Korea spent 3 years building a case against you. Because you sold me to a monster who loved me enough to give me everything back, including my teeth. She stepped closer, and her uncle flinched. You wanted me to pay for your sins, Imani whispered. So I did. And now the debt is settled, the accounts are balanced, and you have 58 minutes to get out of my house before I stop being merciful. They fled into the rain like the rats they'd always been. Hours later, Imani stood on the balcony of Min-jae's fortress, their fortress now, overlooking Seoul's glittering sprawl. His arms wrapped around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder, and for the first time since her parents died, she felt whole. Regrets? He murmured against her neck. She laced her fingers through his, these hands that had killed for her, stolen for her, orchestrated her salvation through damnation. Only one, Imani said softly. That it took me so long to stop being afraid of what we are. The dragon's queen smiled into the night, and the city below trembled.